Imagine standing on the edge of a world so vast, so silent, and so utterly unknown that looking west toward the setting sun feels like staring into the depths of a boundless ocean. It is the year 1803, and the map of the United States ends abruptly at the banks of the Mississippi River. Beyond that churning muddy water lies a mystery that stretches for thousands of miles. A land of rumors, of woolly mammoths thought to still roam the earth, of mountains made of pure salt, and of a legendary Northwest Passage that could connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. This is the story of the greatest odyssey in American history, a journey that would redefine the soul of a nation, told not through the chaos of battle, but through the rhythmic dip of oars in the water, the crackle of campfires under a canopy of western stars, and the slow, steady footsteps of men walking into history. It began with a vision in the mind of Thomas Jefferson, a man who sat in the quiet study of Monticello, surrounded by books and maps that contained more blank spaces than drawn lines. The United States had just purchased the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million, a transaction that instantly doubled the size of the young country. Yet nobody truly knew what had been bought. It was a purchase of silence and space. To unlock this mystery, Jefferson turned to his private secretary, a melancholic but brilliant army captain named Meriwether Lewis. Lewis, in turn, called upon his former commander, a man of steady temperament and unmatched river skills, William Clark. Together, they would form the core of discovery. But before the first boat could launch, there was the preparation, a process so meticulous and detailed that it serves as a calming inventory of survival. Imagine the atmosphere in Philadelphia and Harper's Ferry during that spring of 1803. It was a time of quiet industry. Lewis moved between supply stores, selecting items with the care of a man packing for a journey from which he might never return. The list of supplies itself is a fascinating catalog of the era. He purchased 193 pounds of portable soup, a glue-like substance that could sustain men when game was scarce. He bought mathematical instruments, chronometers, sextants, and compasses, encased in mahogany and brass, tools designed to impose order on the wilderness. He selected gifts for the Native American tribes they would encounter, beads of blue and white, sewing needles, brass thimbles, and peace medals stamped with the profile of the president. There were lead canisters for gunpowder, sealed with wax to prevent moisture from ruining their only defense. The sheer logistics were staggering, yet there was a calm purpose to it all, a methodical gathering of the known world to carry into the unknown. By the winter of 1803, the men had gathered near St. Louis, at the confluence where the Wood River meets the mighty Mississippi. It was here that the core of discovery truly took shape. These were not merely soldiers, they were blacksmiths, carpenters, woodsmen, and hunters. They were men from Kentucky, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania. There was York, Clark's enslaved manservant, who would become a crucial member of the expedition, and George Drouillard, a master hunter and interpreter of French and Shawnee descent. Throughout that cold winter, the air was filled with the sounds of preparation, the sharpening of axes, the mending of moccasins, and the construction of the vessel that would carry them up the Missouri River. The keel boat was a masterpiece of river engineering, 55 feet long, with a shallow draft to navigate the sandbars. It was built to fight the current. It featured a forecastle and a cabin, but its most important features were the means of propulsion, a large square sail for the rare following wind, and 22 oars for the grueling work against the flow. It was a heavy, sturdy beast, painted to resist the rot of the river, a floating fortress that would become their home, their shelter, and their burden. As the snow melted and the green shoots of spring began to appear along the riverbanks, in May of 1804, a quiet tension settled over the camp. The river was rising. The Missouri, known as the Big Muddy, was waking up. On May 14, 1804, the journey officially began. It was a rainy afternoon, the sky a bruised purple, and the air thick with humidity. The men pushed off from the banks near St. Louis, the heavy keelboat cutting into the brown, swirling current of the Missouri River. There was no fanfare, no marching bands, just the command to man the oars and the rhythmic splash of wood hitting water. They were moving upstream, fighting the immense power of a river that drained half a continent. Progress was agonizingly slow, sometimes only 3 or 4 miles a day. The work was hypnotic in its difficulty. When the wind failed and the current was too strong for oars, the men had to use setting poles, planting them in the river bottom and walking the length of the deck to push the boat forward, or worse, cordelling, wading through the mud along the banks, pulling the 55-foot boat with a long rope like ants dragging a leaf. Despite the labor, there was a profound peace to be found in the routine. As they left the settlements of St. Charles behind, the last outpost of civilization, they entered a world of overwhelming natural beauty. The landscape of the lower Missouri was a tunnel of towering cottonwood and sycamore trees, their branches arching over the water to create a cathedral of green. Vines of wild grape hung thick from the canopy, and the air smelled of wet earth, blooming wildflowers, and the distinct metallic scent of the river. Life on the river settled into a cadence. At dawn, the bugle would sound, shattering the morning mist. The men, wrapped in wool blankets, would rise from the damp ground. Breakfast was simple, cornmeal and pork, before the oars hit the water again. The river was a living thing, constantly changing. Sandbars shifted overnight. Submerged trees, known as sawyers, bobbed in the current like sleeping monsters waiting to puncture the hull. Meriwether Lewis spent his days walking along the shore, his dog Seaman, a large black Newfoundland, trotting beside him. Lewis was the naturalist, the observer. He chronicled everything with a sense of wonder that resonates through the centuries. He noted the shape of a leaf, the color of a bird's plumage, the salinity of a mineral spring. His journals are not just a record of travel, they are a love letter to the American landscape. As the summer of 1804 deepened, the heat became oppressive. The humid air of the Midwest clung to the men, and the mosquitoes were a constant humming cloud. Yet the nights brought relief. Imagine the scene. The keelboat moored securely to a willow on the bank, a large fire crackling in the center of the camp, sending sparks up toward the Milky Way, which appeared so bright and dense it looked like a cloud of diamond dust. The only sounds were the popping of the firewood, the gentle lap of the river against the hull, and the distant, lonely howl of a wolf. In these moments, the men would smoke their pipes and listen to the fiddle played by Pierre Cruzat, a one-eyed boatman whose music drifted over the water, a tiny thread of melody in a vast, silent wilderness. They moved past the mouths of tributary rivers, giving them names that reflected their experiences: Cupboard Creek, Nightingale Creek, Lark Creek. The landscape began to change as they pushed further north and west. The dense forests of the lower Missouri gave way to the rolling grandeur of the Great Plains. The sky opened up, becoming a massive dome of blue. Here, the expedition encountered the true lords of the prairie, the buffalo. At first, they saw solitary bulls, old and grazing in the tall grass. Then, they saw the herds. Thousands upon thousands of bison darkened the plains, a moving sea of dark brown wool that shook the earth when they ran. The noise was like distant thunder, a low rumble that could be felt in the chest. Lewis wrote of looking out from a bluff and seeing the prairie blackened with them, a sight of abundance that is almost impossible for the modern mind to comprehend. The wildlife was unafraid. Having never seen a rifle or a white man, the animals watched the boats with curiosity rather than fear. Elk, deer, and antelope grazed near the riverbanks. The prairie dog, which the men called barking squirrels, provided hours of amusement as the explorers tried to capture one of the elusive creatures to send back to President Jefferson. It was a Garden of Eden, untouched and primal, but the river remained their primary adversary. It was relentless. The banks of the Missouri were constantly collapsing, sending tons of earth crashing into the water, creating dangerous waves that threatened to capsize the pirogues. The men were constantly wet, their skin tanned to the color of leather by the sun and wind. Yet there were no complaints recorded in the journals, only a stoic acceptance of the task. By late October, the air turned crisp, and the cottonwood leaves turned a brilliant gold, fluttering down to cover the surface of the river. Frost began to appear on the blankets in the morning. The expedition had reached the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa people in what is now North Dakota. They had traveled 1,600 miles against the current. It was time to stop. The river would soon freeze, becoming a highway of ice. They needed to build a home for the winter. The construction of Fort Mandan was a race against the approaching Arctic cold. The men felled heavy cottonwood trees, notching the logs to build 2 rows of huts arranged in a V shape surrounded by a palisade wall. It was hard, honest work. The sound of axes echoed across the frozen plains. By November, the fort was complete, and the winter set in with a ferocity that stunned the men. The temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The river froze solid, the ice groaning and cracking through the long nights. But inside the fort, there was warmth. Fireplaces roared, and the men passed the long winter months repairing equipment, making new clothing from animal hides, and interacting with their Mandan neighbors. It was here, in the smoky warmth of a Mandan earth lodge, that the expedition met the person who would become the soul of the journey. Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trapper, lived among the Hidatsa with his young Shoshone wife Sacagawea. She was merely a teenager, pregnant with her first child, yet she carried a quiet strength that impressed Clark immediately. They hired Charbonneau as an interpreter, but it was understood that Sacagawea would be the true asset. She knew the lands to the west. She knew the languages of the mountain tribes they would need to befriend to get horses. Her presence would be a signal of peace to anyone they encountered, for a war party never traveled with a woman and a baby. The winter of 1804 to 1805 was a time of stillness. The smoke from the fort's chimneys rose straight up into the breathless frozen air. The sun was a pale disk in a white sky. The men wrote in their journals, the ink sometimes freezing in the pot before they could dip their quills. They celebrated Christmas with a little brandy and a cannon blast, trying to keep spirits high in the middle of the frozen continent. They were thousands of miles from home, suspended in a white void, waiting for the release of spring. As March arrived, the ice on the Missouri began to break up with explosive cracks that sounded like cannon fire. The river began to flow again. The geese returned, their honking filling the sky. It was time to move. On April 7th, 1805, the Corps of Discovery did something remarkable. They sent the heavy keelboat back down the river to St. Louis, loaded with journals, maps, and artifacts for Jefferson. But the permanent party, 33 people, including Sacagawea and her infant son, Jean-Baptiste, turned their faces west. They boarded 2 smaller pirogues and 6 dugout canoes they had carved themselves. This moment, the departure from Fort Mandan, marked the true entry into the unknown. Lewis wrote in his journal that they were about to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width, on which the foot of civilized man had never trodden. The safety of the maps was gone. From here on, every bend in the river was a revelation. The landscape shifted dramatically as they moved west into present-day Montana. The rolling hills became more rugged, the earth drier. The river water, once muddy, began to clear, turning a crystalline blue as it rushed from the melting snows of the distant mountains. The scenery was almost dreamlike in its grandeur. They passed through the white cliffs of the Missouri, where wind and water had carved the white sandstone banks into fantastical shapes. Towers, cathedrals, and ruined cities that existed only in the imagination. Lewis described it as a visionary place where the silence was so profound it felt like a physical weight. The only sound was the wind hissing through the sagebrush and the dip of the paddles. They were climbing the spine of the continent, moving higher with every mile. The wildlife here was different, more dangerous. They encountered the grizzly bear. The Native Americans had spoken of this beast with reverence and fear, but the confident explorers initially dismissed the stories. They quickly learned respect. These bears were massive, ferocious, and incredibly hard to kill with the single-shot rifles of the era. Encounters with grizzlies became heart-stopping moments of adrenaline in the otherwise slow rhythm of the journey, forcing the men to scramble up trees or dive into the river to escape. But the greatest challenge lay ahead. They were looking for the Great Falls of the Missouri, a landmark the Mandan had told them about. The sound reached them before the sight, a distant, continuous roar that grew louder with every mile. When Lewis finally crested a hill and saw the spray rising like smoke in the distance, he was overcome. It was not just one waterfall, but a series of 5 massive cascades stretching over 10 miles of river. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but it was also a logistical nightmare. They could not boat up a waterfall. They would have to portage. The Great Portage was a test of human endurance that defies description. For weeks, under the blistering summer sun, the men had to haul their heavy dugout canoes and all their supplies overland. The ground was covered in prickly pear cactus, which pierced their moccasins and tore at their feet. The wind blew dust into their eyes. They built makeshift wagons, using slices of cottonwood trunks as wheels, dragging the boats inch by inch across the uneven terrain. They were exhausted, battered by hailstorms that left them bruised and shivering, yet they kept moving. It was the sheer stubbornness of the American spirit in action. At night, they would collapse in exhaustion, too tired to even eat, sleeping the deep, dreamless sleep of the utterly spent. Finally, they cleared the falls and put their boats back into the water, but the river had changed. It was no longer the broad Missouri. It was narrowing, twisting, leading them toward a wall of rock that rose abruptly from the plains, the Rocky Mountains, the shining mountains. They stood like a fortress of stone and snow, jagged peaks piercing the blue sky. The men gazed at them with a mixture of awe and dread. There was no water route through that granite wall. They would need horses. They would need the Shoshone. As they paddled into the shadows of the mountains, the river became a shallow, rocky stream. They had reached the headwaters. On August 12, 1805, Meriwether Lewis climbed a ridge and looked down. He expected to see a plain leading to the Columbia River and the Pacific Ocean. Instead, he saw more mountains, range after range of snow-capped peaks stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a crushing realization. The geography of North America was far more complex than anyone had imagined. There was no easy northwest passage. There was only the high, thin air, the smell of pine resin, and the immense, silent indifference of the peaks. The expedition was now walking. They had hidden their canoes by sinking them in the river with rocks, hoping to retrieve them on the return journey. They were desperate for the Shoshone. Without horses, they would die in these mountains when the snows came. It was Sacagawea who recognized the landmarks, the Beaver's Head Rock, and signaled that they were nearing her people. The meeting, when it finally happened, was one of the great coincidences of history. The Shoshone chief, Kamiawait, was Sacagawea's brother. The reunion secured the horses they needed, but the crossing of the Bitterroot Mountains would be the darkest chapter of their voyage. Imagine the silence of the high alpine forests. The snow was already falling in September. The trails were narrow ledges along steep cliffs, slippery with ice. They had no game to hunt. The wildlife had retreated to lower elevations. They were starving. They ate their candles. They considered eating the leather of their moccasins. They called one campsite Hungry Creek. The trees were dense, blocking out the sun, creating a twilight world of gray and green. It was a calm, cold hell. The only sound was the muffled hoofbeats of the horses in the snow and the ragged breathing of the men. They were weak, dysentery racking their bodies, but they were propelled by the belief that the ocean lay somewhere beyond the trees. Then the terrain began to drop. The air grew warmer. They emerged from the timber into the plains of the Nez Perce people. They had survived the crossing. They built new canoes, this time burning out the centers of massive logs in the Nez Perce style. They entered the Columbia River system. The water was fast, gray, and powerful. They were moving downstream now, aided by gravity, racing toward the sea. The landscape changed again, from alpine forest to the high desert of the Columbia Plateau, and then into the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. Moss hung from the trees in great green beards. Fog rolled in thick and heavy. On November 7th, 1805, William Clark wrote in his journal the most famous words of the expedition. Ocean in view. Oh, the joy. They hadn't actually seen the ocean yet. It was the wide estuary of the Columbia, but the smell of salt was in the air. The seagulls were crying overhead. The journey of thousands of miles was nearing its end. They established Fort Clatsop on the Oregon coast near present-day Astoria to wait out the winter. The winter at Fort Clatsop was a study in gray. It rained For all but 12 days of their stay, a cold, relentless drizzle that soaked everything. Their buckskin clothes rotted on their backs. The smoke from their fires stayed trapped in the huts, stinging their eyes. The pounding of the Pacific surf was a constant rhythmic drumbeat in the distance. It was a time of boredom and fleas, of boiling ocean water to make salt, of trading with the Clatsop people for fish and roots. Yet even in this gloom, there was a profound sense of accomplishment. They had done it. They had walked across the continent. They had stitched the map together. As you listen to this, imagine the sound of that Pacific rain falling on the cedar roof of the fort. The steady, hypnotic tapping, the hiss of the logs in the fire, the smell of wet pine and wood smoke. The expedition was resting at the edge of the world, listening to the heartbeat of the ocean, preparing for the long, long journey home. The continent was vast, but it was no longer a mystery. It had been measured by the footsteps of these men, and the silence of the wilderness had been broken, if only for a moment, by the dip of their oars. The relentless rhythmic drumming of rain on split cedar planks defined the world of the Corps of Discovery during the winter of 1805. Imagine a gray that never lifts, a sky that seems to descend until it touches the tops of the massive Sitka spruces, wrapping the entire Oregon coast in a shroud of mist and drizzle. Inside the small, smoke-filled rooms of Fort Clatsop, time seemed to stretch and warp. The dampness was inescapable. It seeped into the marrow of their bones, rotted their leather moccasins until they fell apart like wet paper, and turned their elk-hide clothing into clammy, stiff husks that chafed the skin. For the 33 souls huddled on the edge of the continent, the Pacific Ocean was not a paradise. It was a prison of water and wind. They had achieved their objective, reaching the western edge of the map, but the triumph was muted by the sheer struggle for survival. The days were short, the nights long, and filled with the scratching of fleas, hordes of them that infested the bedding and the furs, making uninterrupted sleep a luxury no one could afford. The smoke from the constant fires, necessary to ward off the chill, had nowhere to go in the heavy air, hanging in the rooms and stinging their eyes until they wept. Yet there was a quiet, industrious beauty in their perseverance. Even in this sodden gloom, the American spirit of ingenuity remained alight. Down the coast, at a place now known as Seaside, a detachment of men established a salt works. Picture the scene: a lonely beach, the roar of the gray ocean crashing against the black rocks, and 5 brass kettles boiling seawater day and night over a fire that hissed and spat with the damp wood. For weeks, the men tended these fires, watching the water evaporate to leave behind the precious white crystals, 28 gallons of salt. It was a monotonous, hypnotic task, listening to the surf and the wind scraping the kettle, preserving the mineral that would make their return journey's tasteless meat bearable. Food was the constant obsession. The elk, so plentiful when they arrived, had retreated into the deep, tangled forests of the coastal mountains. The hunters, Druyard and the Field brothers, would vanish into the dripping timber for days, tracking the ghosts of the forest through ferns that grew as tall as men. When they returned with meat, it was often lean and spoiled quickly in the humid air. They ate elk until the very smell of it sickened them. They traded with the Clatsop and Chinook tribes for fish and wapato roots, a bulbous plant that tasted like a potato. But the cultural divide was vast. The coastal tribes were shrewd traders, unimpressed by the exhausted explorers, and the exchanges were often tense, conducted in the sign language that had become the universal tongue of the frontier. As March of 1806 arrived, the weather began to shift, not to sunshine, but to a restless, stormy energy. The decision was made to leave. In a democratic moment rare for military expeditions, the captains had allowed the entire group, including the enslaved man York and the Shoshone woman Sacagawea, to vote on the location of their winter quarters. Now, that same collective will turned eastward. They were going home. On March 23, 1806, under a sky that threatened yet another deluge, they handed over the fort to the local Clatsop chief, Cobaway, and pushed their dugout canoes into the Columbia River. They were turning their backs on the Pacific, facing the interior of the continent once more. The psychological shift was profound. On the way west, they had been driven by curiosity and the pull of the unknown. Now, they were driven by memory. They remembered the taste of corn, the warmth of the sun on the plains, and the faces of families they hadn't seen in 2 years. But the river that had carried them down to the sea so swiftly in the autumn was now a different beast. They were traveling against the current. The Columbia in the spring is a spectacle of raw power, swollen with the early melt of mountain snows. Every stroke of the paddle was a battle against gravity. The men, their muscles hardened by years of toil, fell into a cadence of exertion, their breath sinking with the splash of the oars. The journey up the Columbia Gorge was a slow, grinding ascent through a landscape of mythical proportions. The river here cuts through the Cascade Mountain Range, creating a wind tunnel where gusts can rip the water into whitecaps in seconds. Towering cliffs of basalt, black and jagged, rose thousands of feet on either side, weeping with waterfalls that dissolved into mist before hitting the river. It was a place of shadows and echoes. As they rode, they passed the submerged forests, ghostly trees standing upright deep underwater, drowned by ancient landslides, a reminder of the violent geology of the West. Progress was agonizing. They averaged only a few miles a day. The short narrows and the long narrows, choke points where the entire volume of the Columbia was squeezed between rock walls, were impassable against the flood. Here, the expedition was forced to portage again. It was a brutal repetition of their earlier trials. They unloaded the canoes, hefting the heavy crates of ammunition, the botanical specimens, and the meager supplies, and carried them over slippery, jagged rocks. The canoes themselves, carved from massive ponderosa pines, weighed nearly a ton when waterlogged. Dragging them over the portage trails, the men's shoulders ached and their tempers flared. It was during these portages that the expedition encountered the river people, the Wishram and Wasco tribes. These were the gatekeepers of the Columbia, living in permanent wooden villages that smelled of drying salmon. The salmon was the lifeblood of the region. Even in the off-season, the dried fish was stacked in bales like cordwood, a currency of protein that sustained thousands. The explorers, hungry and exhausted, were often at odds with the locals. The Native Americans, seeing the ragged, desperate strangers, were sometimes inclined to pilfer small items, an axe, a knife. Lewis, usually calm, found his patience fraying. He threatened violence, a sign of the immense stress he carried. Yet, amidst the tension, there were moments of grace. They paused to smoke the pipe, the blue smoke drifting over the turbulent water, trying to bridge the gap between two worlds that barely understood one another. By April, the landscape began to open up again. The dark forests of the coast and the claustrophobic gorge gave way to the high desert of the Columbia Plateau. The air grew drier, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. The sun finally broke through the gray ceiling, warming their backs. To the south, the white pyramid of Mount Hood stood sentinel, a beacon they remembered from the descent. But a new problem arose. The river was becoming too fast, too wild. They could no longer paddle. They needed horses. The transition from river travel to overland travel was a logistical pivot that required diplomacy. They reached the lands of the Walla Walla tribe, where they were greeted with a warmth that revitalized their spirits. The chief, Yelepit, was a man of great dignity who saw the ragged explorers not as intruders, but as guests. Imagine the relief of the men as they were invited into the village, where drums played a steady rhythm and the people danced in celebration of their arrival. For the first time in months, they felt safe. Yelepit presented Clark with a magnificent white horse, a gesture of status and friendship. In return, Clark gave the chief his own sword, a symbol of his authority. It was a moment of mutual respect under the vast blue bowl of the desert sky. Moving further east, they sought out the Nez Perce, the people who had saved them from starvation the previous autumn. They needed to retrieve the horses they had left in the care of Chief Twisted Hair. Riding across the rolling hills of the Palouse, the grass lush and green from the spring rains, they felt a surge of freedom. The canoe, that cramped, wet vessel of their confinement, was behind them. Now, they were horsemen again. But when they reached the Nez Perce villages in May, a crushing reality awaited them. They looked toward the Bitterroot Mountains, the terrible, jagged barrier they had crossed before, and saw only white. The snow was still deep. The peaks were buried under 10 to 15 feet of winter's accumulation. The locals told them it would be weeks, perhaps months, before the passes were clear. To attempt a crossing now would be suicide. So the Corps of Discovery did something they were not used to. They waited. They established Camp Chopunish in the Kamaya Valley of present-day Idaho. It was a forced intermission in the great drama of their return. The camp was set in a beautiful meadow, surrounded by pine trees and carpeted with wildflowers, blue camas, and yellow balsam root. The air was filled with the song of meadowlarks. It should have been a paradise, a time to rest. But for men desperate to get home, the waiting was a torment. To pass the time and to acquire food, Lewis and Clark transformed themselves into doctors. The Nez Perce, suffering from eye infections and various ailments, came to the captains for help. With a limited supply of medicines, the captains used simple remedies: eye water made from vitriol, salves of pine resin and beeswax, and occasionally a little camphor. Whether it was the medicine or the faith the patients placed in these strange, powerful men, many were healed. In exchange, the tribe paid them in food, roots, and dogs. The men of the expedition had grown fond of dog meat. It was fatty and filling, unlike the lean venison or the dry salmon. Lewis admitted in his journal that he preferred it to almost anything else, though Clark, ever the traditionalist, could never quite bring himself to enjoy it. The weeks at Camp Chopunish were a study in patience. The men held shooting contests with the Nez Perce, marveling at the skill of the native archers while showing off the accuracy of their Kentucky long rifles. They raced horses across the meadows, the thunder of hooves replacing the roar of the river. They mended their clothes, sewing new shirts from leather, trying to make themselves presentable for the civilization they hoped to see again. But every morning they looked east. They watched the snow line on the mountains. It retreated agonizingly slowly. The peaks remained a blinding white wall, silent and impassable. During this interlude, the grizzly bears returned to the narrative. The lush valley was filled with them. The hunters, venturing out for deer, often found themselves the hunted. In the thick brush along the river, a rustle of leaves could explode into 1,000 pounds of fury. One afternoon, a young private named Bratton, still weak from a lingering back injury, was approached by a bear while alone. He managed to fire a shot, wounding the animal, but had to scramble for his life as the beast tore through the undergrowth. These encounters kept the men sharp, a reminder that even in this peaceful valley, they were visitors in a wild kingdom. As June arrived, the anxiety in the camp became palpable. The captains were checking the river levels, the budding of the trees, any sign that summer had truly arrived in the high country. They gathered the men and made a bold, perhaps reckless, decision. They would not wait for the snow to melt completely. They would attempt the crossing on the crusted snow, hoping it would support the weight of the horses. On June 15th, 1806, they struck camp. The cavalcade moved out, 66 horses strong, winding their way up the foothills toward the Lolo Trail. The mood was a mix of determination and dread. They remembered the hunger, the cold, and the exhaustion of the previous crossing. As they climbed, the green valley floor fell away, replaced by the stark, vertical world of the mountains. The air grew thin and cold. The trees became stunted, and then they hit the snow. It was a world of blinding white. The trail, usually marked by stones or rubbed trees, was buried under 12 feet of snow. The trees that usually towered overhead were now only waist high, their tops poking through the drift. The silence was absolute. There were no birds, no wind, no sound but the crunch of hoof on ice. They pushed forward, mile after grueling mile, relying on the instinct of their guide and the strength of the horses. But the geography was confusing. The landmarks were gone, smoothed over by the winter blanket. For the first time in the entire expedition, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark looked at each other and admitted defeat. They were lost. To continue would mean wandering into the frozen labyrinth of the Bitterroots to die of exposure. Reluctantly, with heavy hearts, they ordered the retreat. They turned the horses around and descended back toward the Green Valley, back to the Quamash Flats. It was a humbling moment. The most competent explorers of their age had been turned back not by armies, but by the sheer indifferent scale of the American landscape. They needed guides. They needed the Nez Perce. After a few days of regrouping and hiring 3 young Nez Perce guides who knew the high trails intimately, they set out again. This second attempt, beginning in late June, was different. The guides moved with confidence through the white void, reading the landscape in ways the white men could not. Noticing the stress on a branch, the shape of a drift, the faint depression of the trail beneath the snow. They rode over the frozen drifts at a trot, covering nearly 30 miles a day. It was a surreal cavalry charge across the roof of the continent. At night, they camped on top of the snow, building fires on stone platforms to keep them from melting into the drifts. They melted snow for water and ate the last of their dried meat, huddled together for warmth under the vast, star-strewn sky of the high Rockies. On June 29th, they emerged from the snowpack. They reached the bubbling hot springs at Lolo Creek, a place of steam and sulfur where they had stopped on the way west. The water was scalding hot, a sharp contrast to the frozen world they had just traversed. The men bathed in the stone pools, the heat soaking into their tired muscles. They washed away the sweat of the crossing and the grime of the winter. They were through. The wall had been breached. Now, standing on the eastern side of the Great Divide, the geography of the return journey changed. The water flowed east, toward the Missouri, toward the Mississippi, toward home. But here, the captains made a decision that would split the party and expose them to new dangers. They decided to separate. To maximize the scientific and geographical yield of the return, they would divide the Corps. Lewis would take a group north to explore the Meriwether River, hoping to find that it reached far into Canada, a geopolitical gamble to expand American claims. Clark would take the rest of the party south to the Yellowstone River, a massive tributary they had only heard rumors of. It was a risky plan. Dividing forces in hostile territory violated every military maxim. But their confidence was high. They were veterans of the wilderness now. On July 3rd, 1806, at a place they called Traveler's Rest, the two captains, friends who had shared a single tent for years, shook hands and parted ways. Lewis rode north with 9 men and the dog, Seaman. Clark rode south with the rest, including Sacagawea and the baby. The silence of the narrative now splits into 2 threads. Imagine Lewis riding into the vast open plains of what is now northern Montana. It is Blackfeet country. The Blackfeet were the most powerful military force on the northern plains, known for their fierce protection of their hunting grounds. Lewis knew this. As he rode through the tall grass, scanning the horizon with his telescope, the tension was electric. The sky was big and ominous, often piling up with summer thunderstorms that dropped curtains of rain in the distance. They were moving into a void, a place where American diplomacy had no purchase. Meanwhile, to the south, Clark was entering a landscape of bizarre beauty. He was heading toward the Yellowstone, a river that cut through a land of painted canyons and sandstone pillars. Sacagawea, now back in familiar territory, was invaluable. She pointed out the mountain passes, the gap in the range that would lead them to the river. Clark's journey was becoming a float trip through a geological wonderland. But for Lewis, up on the Meriwether River, the shadows were lengthening. The vastness of the plains was about to close in. As the sun set on the evening of July 26, 1806, Lewis and his small party spotted horses on a ridge. Then figures. 8 warriors. They were Blackfeet, specifically the Piegan band. The meeting that every member of the expedition had feared for 2 years was about to happen. There was no retreating. Lewis ordered his men to tighten their saddles and check their rifles. He rode forward, his hand raised in the universal sign of peace, but his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence of the plains was broken by the wind whipping through the grass, a sound that felt like a warning whisper before the storm. The most violent day of the expedition was dawning. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged horizon of the Two Medicine River Valley on that evening of July 26, 1806, casting long, bruised shadows across the high plains of what is now Montana. Meriwether Lewis, accompanied by only 3 men, George Drouillard and the Field brothers Joseph and Reuben, watched as the 8 Blackfeet warriors rode toward them. The silence of the plains, usually broken only by the wind hissing through the needle and thread grass, was suddenly heavy with tension. This was the moment the expedition had dreaded since leaving St. Louis. A confrontation with the lords of the northern plains, the Piegan Blackfeet, who controlled the access to the Saskatchewan River and the British fur trade to the north. The encounter began with a wary ritual of diplomacy. Lewis, displaying a calm he likely did not feel, rode out to meet them. There were handshakes, tentative and stiff. The warriors were young, their faces painted, their eyes sharp and assessing. They camped together that night in a small depression near the river, a place sheltered from the wind, but intimate in its danger. A fire was built. Through Drouillard's sign language, they spoke of peace, of trade, and of the other tribes the Americans had armed. The Blackfeet listened, their expressions unreadable in the flickering firelight. As the embers died down, Lewis took the first watch. The stars wheeled overhead in the vast, indifferent sky, and the river murmured nearby, but sleep was a stranger to the camp. At dawn on July 27th, the world exploded into motion. It happened in the gray half-light of morning. The warriors, seeing an opportunity, moved to seize the expedition's rifles while the men slept. It was a scuffle of desperate confusion, shouts, the sound of bodies colliding, the wrestling for weapons. Reuben Field chased a warrior who had grabbed his gun, stabbing him in the chest. Lewis, waking to the chaos, drew his pistol. A shot rang out. One warrior fell. The others, realizing the Americans would fight to the death, retreated, driving off some of the expedition's horses. What followed was the most grueling physical feat of the entire journey, a ride that belongs in the annals of American legend. Lewis and his 3 men knew the main Blackfeet war party could be just over the ridge. They had to run. They saddled their remaining horses and rode. They rode not for an hour, but for nearly 24 hours straight. Imagine the sheer physical punishment of that ride, the rhythmic pounding of the hooves, the dust coating their throats, the sun beating down on their buckskins, and the constant adrenaline-fueled scanning of the horizon for pursuing riders. They covered 120 miles in a single day, a distance that defies belief. They rode until the horses' chests were heaving with foam, until their own legs were numb. It was a flight through a beautiful, terrifying void, a landscape of coulees and buttes that seemed to stretch on forever. While Lewis was galloping for his life across the northern plains, William Clark was drifting through a paradise. His journey down the Yellowstone River offers a stark, peaceful counterpoint to Lewis's desperate escape. Clark's party, including Sacagawea, her baby Pomp, and the rest of the men, had built 2 dugout canoes and were letting the current carry them east. The Yellowstone was a ribbon of clear, cold water cutting through a land of abundance. The buffalo was so numerous here that they often had to stop the boats to let vast herds cross the river, a living dam of dark brown wool and horns that churned the water into white froth. The noise was a low, constant thunder that vibrated in the hulls of the canoes. On July 25th, just a day before Lewis's fight, Clark stopped at a massive sandstone formation rising 200 feet from the riverbank. It stood like a solitary tower in the wilderness, a beacon of stone. Clark named it Pompey's Tower, now Pompey's Pillar, after Sacagawea's little boy, whom he had affectionately nicknamed Pomp, meaning dancing boy in Shoshone. Clark climbed the rock, his boots crunching on the loose shale. From the top, he looked out over a kingdom of wild game, thousands of elk, buffalo, and wolves moving across the green valley floor. In a rare act of personal graffiti, he carved his name and the date into the soft stone. William Clark, July 25, 1806. It remains there today, the only physical evidence of the expedition left on the landscape, a quiet signature on the canvas of the West. The mosquitoes on the Yellowstone, however, were a plague. Clark described them as being so thick that he could not aim his rifle without breathing them in. The baby, Jean-Baptiste, was bitten so badly his face swelled, yet the party drifted on, the river doing the work. The water was dropping, the summer heat intensifying. They were moving toward the rendezvous point, the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri, hoping Lewis was still alive. The reunion of the two captains on August 12, 1806, was a moment of profound relief. Though it occurred under strange circumstances, Lewis's party, having survived the Blackfeet, had made it back to the Missouri. But a day earlier, while hunting elk in the dense willows, Lewis had been shot, not by an Indian, but by one of his own men. Pierre Cruzat, the one-eyed fiddler, had mistaken the captain's buckskins for an elk in the thick brush. The bullet passed through Lewis's buttocks, a painful and humiliating wound that left him unable to walk. When Clark's canoes spotted Lewis's boat drifting down the river, they expected a triumphant wave. Instead, they found Lewis lying on his stomach, pale and in pain, but alive. The two friends were back together. The core of discovery was whole again. Now, the river became a highway home. The Missouri, which had fought them every inch of the way on the ascent, now carried them with the speed of a galloping horse. They were traveling downstream, aided by the spring runoff and the sheer volume of water. They covered 50, sometimes 70 miles a day. The landscape began to rewind. The mountains faded into the blue distance behind them, replaced by the rolling hills of the Dakotas. On August 14th, they reached the Mandan villages, the place where they had spent that first frozen winter. The reunion with the Mandan and Hidatsa chiefs was warm, but the world had changed. The expedition was in a hurry. They had seen the Pacific, and the pull of St. Louis was magnetic. Here, however, they had to say goodbye to the family that had been the heart of the journey. Toussaint Charbonneau was paid $500.33 for his services. Sacagawea, the woman who had walked across the continent carrying the future on her back, received nothing, no wages, no title. But Clark, a man who had grown to love her son as his own, made a remarkable offer. He told Charbonneau that if they would bring the boy to St. Louis when he was older, Clark would educate him and raise him as his own son. It was a promise of connection that transcended the cultural divide. As the boats prepared to leave, one man stayed on the bank. John Coulter, a reliable hunter and woodsman, asked for permission to be discharged early. He had met two fur trappers heading west, back up the river, and he wanted to join them. Think of the psychology of this man. He had just spent 2 years surviving starvation, grizzlies, and freezing cold. Yet the moment he smelled the civilization of the approaching states, he turned his back on it. He chose the wilderness. He would go on to become the first white man to see the geysers of Yellowstone and the Teton Range, a legend of the mountain men. The boats pushed off, leaving Coulter standing on the shore, a solitary figure shrinking against the vastness of the plains. The descent from the Mandan villages was a blur of speed and changing seasons. The air grew heavy with the humidity of the Midwest. The cottonwoods were turning yellow again. They passed the grave of Sergeant Charles Floyd, the only man to die on the expedition, finding his cedar post disturbed by wolves, but his memory intact. They met traders coming upriver, boats from St. Louis laden with whiskey and trade goods. These encounters were electric. The traders stared at the explorers as if they were seeing ghosts. "We thought you were dead," they said. "The president has given up hope." Lewis and Clark, bearded, dressed in skins, their skin dark as mahogany from the sun, laughed. They were not dead. They were the most alive men on the continent. They learned news of the world they had left behind. Alexander Hamilton had been killed in a duel by Aaron Burr. The Napoleonic Wars were raging in Europe, but to the men of the Corps, these events felt distant, almost trivial, compared to the reality of the river, the mountains, and the great silence they had just traversed. By September, the landscape had become undeniably familiar. The trees were the oaks and walnuts of the lower Missouri. They saw cows grazing on the banks, a sight that brought tears to their eyes. Cows meant farms. Farms meant families. Families meant home. They stopped at the small settlement of La Charrette, the first white village they had seen in over 2 years. The people rushed to the banks, cheering, firing guns in the air, offering them cider and corn. It was a hero's welcome in the raw, muddy frontier. On September 23, 1806, a rainy Tuesday morning, the keelboat and the canoes drifted into the harbor of St. Louis. The city, then a town of about 1,000 people, emptied out onto the riverfront. The news spread like wildfire. They have returned. The Pacific men have returned. There was no telegraph, no radio, just the shouting of voices and the ringing of church bells. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark stepped off the boat, their moccasins touching the cobblestones of the landing. They had been gone for 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days. They had traveled over 8,000 miles. The expedition was over, but the story was just beginning. The maps they carried in their waterproof tin cases would change the world. They had filled in the blank spaces. They had documented 178 plants and 122 animals previously unknown to science. The coyote, the grizzly bear, the prairie dog, the magpie. They had met dozens of nations, navigated the most dangerous rivers on the continent, and lost only one man. As the crowd surrounded them, pulling at their buckskins, asking 1,000 questions, imagine the sensory overload for the captains. After the silence of the high Rockies, the roar of the ocean and the quiet camaraderie of the campfire, the noise of the town must have been deafening. They walked to the post office to send the letter that Thomas Jefferson had been waiting for. The letter that simply said, "We have returned." Yet, even in the celebration, there was a sense of an ending. The core of discovery, that perfect, self-reliant society that had functioned so beautifully in the wilderness, was dissolving. They would go their separate ways. The brotherhood of the river would live on only in memory and ink. The West was no longer a mystery. It was a destination. The gate had been opened. The sun set on St. Louis that night, shining on the muddy waters of the Mississippi. waters that had traveled all the way from the lands the expedition had just left. The men slept in real beds for the first time in years, the softness strange and uncomfortable beneath them. Outside, the river flowed on, a dark, silent ribbon connecting the known to the unknown, the past to the future. The map was drawn, the continent was measured, but in the quiet of their dreams, they were likely still out there under the vast western stars, listening to the dip of the oars and the call of the meadowlark. This concludes the journey of the Corps of Discovery, but not the story of the American West. The path they cut would become a wagon trail, then a railroad, then a highway. But for now, let us leave them in the warm glow of their return, safe in the knowledge that they had done the impossible. They had gone to the edge of the world and come back. The history of the land had been written in their footsteps, a history of endurance, wonder, and the quiet, persistent rhythm of a river flowing to the sea. The shouting in the streets of St. Louis eventually faded, replaced by the cool, quiet winds of late autumn in 1806. The grand celebration of the return was over, and the reality of the post-expedition world began to settle upon the men of the Corps of Discovery. Imagine the strange sensation of sleeping in a feather bed after 2 years of sleeping on the hard earth, wrapped in buffalo robes. For Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, the silence of the bedroom was often more unsettling than the howl of the wilderness. They would wake in the middle of the night, reaching for rifles that were no longer necessary, listening for the snap of a twig or the rush of a river that was miles away. The wilderness had entered their blood, and civilization, with its stiff collars and polite dinner conversations, felt like a costume they were forced to wear. The final chapter of this great American odyssey is not about the journey of the body, but the journey of memory and legacy. It is the story of what happened when the map was finally unrolled. In the winter of 1807, Lewis and Clark traveled to Washington City, as the capital was then called, to meet with the man who had dreamed it all, Thomas Jefferson. Picture the scene in the president's house. It was not the grand mansion we know today, but a drafty, echoing building still under construction, surrounded by muddy roads. In a room lit by the warm glow of oil lamps and a roaring fireplace, the two captains laid out their masterpiece, the map of the West. It was a revelation. Before this moment, the map of the United States ended at the Mississippi. Beyond that was a blank white space labeled simply unknown. Now, ink lines traced the veins of the continent. The Missouri River twisted like a snake across the parchment. The Rocky Mountains rose in jagged peaks where flat plains were thought to be. The Columbia River crashed into the Pacific. Jefferson, the scholar president, traced the lines with his finger, his eyes wide with wonder. He saw the future of the nation in that drawing. The blank space had been filled. The mystery was solved. But for the men who had drawn those lines, life took divergent paths, drifting apart like leaves on a divergent current. William Clark, the steady, reliable compass of the expedition, found a life of prominence and stability. He married Julia Hancock, a woman from Virginia whom he had named a river after, the Judith River, during the trek. Clark settled in St. Louis, becoming the superintendent of Indian Affairs. His office became a living museum of the West, filled with grizzly bear claws, peace pipes, detailed maps, and the journals that held the daily heartbeat of the journey. He was the man everyone came to see if they wanted to understand the frontier. He lived a long life, a bridge between the old world and the new, his hair turning white as he watched the sleepy fur-trading post of St. Louis transform into the gateway to the West. Meriwether Lewis, however, struggled to find his footing in the stillness of civilization. The brilliance that had allowed him to catalog hundreds of plants and animals, to navigate the complex diplomacy of the tribes, and to lead men through the impossible, turned inward. He was appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory, a prestigious title, but he was a man of the woods, not a man of paperwork and politics. He missed the clarity of the mission. In the wilderness, the goal was simple: survive and move west. In the governor's mansion, the goals were murky, filled with land disputes and petty arguments. Lewis's end is a somber note in the history, a reminder of the toll such journeys take on the human soul. In October 1809, traveling along the Natchez Trace, a lonely forested road in Tennessee, Lewis died of gunshot wounds at a roadside inn called Grinder's Stand. Whether it was by his own hand, driven by a profound melancholia, or by the hand of bandits, remains a mystery that the forest has kept to this day. He was only 35 years old. The man who had conquered the continent could not conquer the silence of his own mind. A broken column monument stands over his grave today, symbolizing a life cut short, surrounded by the Tennessee oaks he would have been able to name in Latin. And what of the others? The cast of characters who had paddled, pulled, and walked across history. Sacagawea, the young Shoshone mother, remains one of the most enigmatic figures. After the expedition, she and Toussaint Charbonneau spent some time in St. Louis, where Clark tried to help them establish a farm. But the call of the wild was too strong for Charbonneau, and the farm life too foreign. They returned to the upper Missouri, to the fur-trading forts. History tells us she died young in 1812 at Fort Manuel Lisa in present-day South Dakota of a putrid fever. She was only about 24. Clark, hearing of her death, wrote in his notes, "Sacagawea, dead." It was a heavy final word for the woman who had saved their journals when the boat capsized, who had found them food when they were starving. But her legacy lived on in her son, Jean-Baptiste, Little Pomp. Clark kept his promise. He paid for the boy's education in St. Louis. Pomp did not fade into obscurity. He lived a life that was as extraordinary as his infancy. He became a favorite of European royalty, traveling to Germany and Africa, learning 4 languages, playing the piano, and living in palaces. Yet, like the men of the expedition, the West called him back. He returned to America to become a mountain man, a guide, and a gold miner. He is the only member of the expedition to act as a physical link between the age of Jefferson and the California gold rush. He is buried in the high desert of Oregon, not far from the waters his infant eyes had watched from the cradleboard. York, the enslaved man who had been the first African American to cross the continent, who had voted on where to build the winter fort, faced the harshest reality. Upon return, he asked for his freedom, arguing that his service on the expedition, where he had hunted, worked, and suffered alongside the white men, had earned it. Clark, bound by the social structures of the time, initially refused. It is a painful chapter in the story, a reminder of the imperfections of the era. Eventually, York was granted his freedom, but accounts of his later life are ghostly. Some say he became a successful wagon driver in Tennessee. Others say he returned to the Rockies to live among the Crow Indians, who had respected him as a great warrior. One likes to imagine him there in the mountains, finally and truly free. John Coulter, the man who had asked to leave the expedition early at the Mandan villages, became the prototype of the American mountain man. He ventured into the Yellowstone region alone, with nothing but a rifle and a pack. He returned with stories of geysers that shot boiling water hundreds of feet into the air, of bubbling mud pots and smoking earth. People in St. Louis laughed at him, calling it Coulter's Hell. They didn't believe such a place could exist. He had seen the geothermal wonders of Yellowstone National Park nearly 70 years before it was officially discovered. Coulter's life was one of almost mythical survival, running naked across a plain of prickly pear cactus to escape Blackfeet warriors, hiding under a log raft in a freezing river while enemies walked above him. He was the wild spirit of the expedition that refused to come indoors. As the years turned into decades, the physical evidence of the Corps of Discovery began to fade. The heavy keelboat was likely sold for scrap wood. Fort Clatsop rotted into the wet Oregon earth, the ferns and moss reclaiming the wood until it was indistinguishable from the forest floor. Fort Mandan was swallowed by the shifting channel of the Missouri River, washed away as if it had never been. But the invisible mark they left was indelible. The Northwest Passage they sought, a water route for ships, did not exist. But they had created a different kind of passage. They had opened the door. In their wake came the fur trappers, then the missionaries, then the wagon trains of the Oregon Trail. The silence of the prairie, once broken only by the wind and the buffalo, was soon filled with the creak of wagon wheels and the lowing of cattle. The landscape they traversed has changed. Yet in the quiet places, it remains ancient and untouched. If you were to stand today on the banks of the Missouri River in central Montana, in the section known as the White Cliffs, you would see the same white sandstone citadels that Lewis described in his journal. The water there is still cool and clear. The swallows still build their mud nests in the canyon walls. The cottonwood trees still rustle with the sound of 1,000 paper fans. Imagine for a moment that the timeline dissolves. It is night on the river. The year does not matter. The water is a flat, dark mirror reflecting the Milky Way, which stretches across the sky like a spilled bucket of diamond dust. The air is cool and smells of sagebrush and damp willow. A campfire crackles on the bank, the yellow flames licking at the darkness. Around the fire, the men are sleeping. They're wrapped in wool blankets, their breathing slow and rhythmic, syncing with the flow of the river. Lewis is there, writing by the firelight, his pen scratching across the paper, trying to capture the exact shade of blue of a jay's feather. Clark is checking the map, measuring the distance to the next bend. Sacagawea is humming a soft, low tune to Pomp. The fiddle of Pierre Crozat is silent in its case, but the music of the river plays on. This is the enduring gift of the story. It is a reminder of the vastness of the American continent, a land so big that it can absorb all our noises and still offer silence. It is a story of human endurance, of putting one foot in front of the other when the destination is unknown. The United States was changed forever by this journey. It grew up. It stretched its arms from sea to shining sea. But the heart of the story remains in the quiet moments, the shared meal of elk meat after a week of hunger, The awe of seeing a waterfall for the first time, the simple, profound act of sleeping under the stars in a land where no map existed. As you drift toward sleep now, let your mind wander west. Float down the Ohio River, merge into the Mississippi, and turn upstream into the Missouri. Push against the current, past the swaying grasslands of the Dakotas, past the Badlands, up into the high, thin air of the Rockies. Cross the snowy peaks where the silence is absolute. Drift down the clear, rushing waters of the Columbia, smell the pine and the salt, and finally stand on the edge of the continent, where the ocean rolls in with a steady, calming rhythm. The waves crash, the waves recede, the waves crash, the waves recede. The core of discovery has gone home. The boats are docked, the journals are closed, the fire has burned down to glowing embers. The history is written, and the land is at rest. And now, so are you. The great journey is over. Good night. The leather-bound journals of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, now resting quietly in climate-controlled vaults in Philadelphia and St. Louis, are more than just books of history. They are time capsules of a world that was quieter, darker, and more vast than we can easily imagine today. In this final chapter of our journey, we do not follow the footsteps of the men, for their marching is done. Instead, we will drift like smoke over the landscape they documented, exploring the deep, calming legacy of the American West that they unveiled. This is a meditation on the plants, the waters, and the silence that still endures in the hidden corners of the continent, a landscape that waits for you now in the realm of imagination and sleep. Imagine the smell of the journals themselves. They are bound in red Morocco leather, stained with the sweat of the portage, the grease of bear fat, and the water of the Columbia. Open one, and you find the pressed leaves of a plant collected 200 years ago. Lewis was a meticulous botanist. He didn't just walk through the woods. He stopped to shake hands with them. He collected specimens of the Osage orange, the bitterroot, and the snowberry. Let us focus on the cottonwood tree, the silent hero of the expedition. Throughout the Great Plains, along the Missouri and the Yellowstone, the cottonwood was the only source of shade, fuel, and shelter. Imagine standing beneath one of these giants in the heat of a Dakota summer. The bark is deeply furrowed, gray and rough, like the skin of an ancient elephant. The leaves are shaped like spades, thick and glossy green. They're attached to the branch by a flattened stem, which allows them to twist and flutter in the slightest breeze. This creates a sound unique to the American West, a soft, continuous clapping or rustling that sounds remarkably like falling rain. For the core of discovery, this sound was the lullaby that put them to sleep every night for 2 years. Visualize the Great Plains as they were then. It was a sea of grass, a short grass prairie, dominated by blue grama and buffalo grass. This was not a flat, manicured lawn, but a living, breathing ocean of vegetation that changed color with the wind. When the wind blew from the north, the silver undersides of the grass blades would flip up, sending waves of metallic light rippling across miles of open land. The scent of this place is distinct. It smells of sun-baked earth, dry straw, and the sweet herbal fragrance of sagebrush. Sagebrush. It is the perfume of the high desert. Lewis described it as aromatic herbs. If you crush a sprig of sagebrush between your fingers, it releases a sharp, clean, camphor-like scent that clears the mind. It is a smell that signifies resilience, for the plant survives in the driest, harshest conditions. The expedition walked through waist-high fields of this silver-green shrub for weeks. The dust from the leaves would coat their leggings, carrying the scent into their tents at night. It is a grounding scent, one that speaks of endurance and the slow, steady passage of time. As we drift further west in our mind's eye, following the ghost of the Missouri River, we encounter the White Cliffs region again. But this time let us linger on the geology. These sandstone formations were laid down millions of years ago when an ancient sea covered the interior of North America. The water retreated and the wind and rain began their work, carving the soft stone into the shapes of castles and spires. The silence here is profound. The stone absorbs sound. If you were to shout, your voice would simply vanish into the vastness. The river flows past these white walls with a glassy smoothness, reflecting the blue sky so perfectly that it's hard to tell where the water ends and the air begins. The wildlife that the expedition cataloged is part of this peaceful tapestry. Consider the pronghorn, which Lewis called the speed of the prairie. They're tan and white, blending perfectly with the dry grass. They do not run with a galloping gait, but with a smooth, flowing motion, like water pouring over stones. They are the fastest land animals in the Western Hemisphere, ghosts that appear and disappear in the shimmering heat haze. And then there is the western meadowlark. Its song is a flute-like bubbling melody that drops down the scale, a sound of pure joy that pierces the morning silence. Lewis noted this bird with affection. Even today, if you stand on a lonely fence line in Montana, you will hear that same song, a musical thread connecting you to the morning of 1805. Let us move up into the high country, the Bitterroot Mountains. Here, the air changes. It becomes thin, crisp, and smells of pine resin and cold stone. The dominant tree here is the ponderosa pine. These are massive trees, their trunks glowing a warm puzzle-piece orange in the sunlight. If you press your nose against the bark of a ponderosa on a warm day, it smells distinctively of vanilla and butterscotch. It is a warm, comforting scent in a cold landscape. The forest floor is carpeted with needles, soft and springy underfoot, silencing every step. The light here filters through the canopy in shafts, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stillness. The water of the mountain streams is different from the muddy Missouri. It is snow melt. It is clear, icy, and incredibly fast. It tumbles over granite boulders, creating a white noise that is perfect for sleeping. It is a constant, low-frequency roar that masks all other sounds. The rocks in the stream are smooth and rounded, colored green, purple, and red by the minerals. The water is so cold it numbs the skin instantly, a shock of purity that reminds you of the glaciers from which it came. The expedition also spent a wet, gray winter on the Pacific coast. While they complained of the rain, there is a deep, hypnotic beauty to the temperate rainforest. Imagine the moss. It hangs from the Sitka spruce and western hemlock trees in long, green beards. It covers the fallen logs, the rocks, the very ground itself. It acts as a sponge, absorbing the rain and the sound. The forest at Fort Clatsop is one of the quietest places on earth because of this insulation. The rain does not pound. It drips. It is a soft, rhythmic plip, plip, plip on the broad leaves of the ferns. The air is thick with oxygen and the smell of wet cedar and decaying wood, a rich, earthy smell that feels like the breath of the planet itself. Now let us look up. The night sky that the core of discovery slept under was a sky we can scarcely imagine today. There was no light pollution, no city glow on the horizon. When the sun went down, true darkness fell. The Milky Way was not a faint smear. It was a three-dimensional river of light, dense and clouded with nebulae. The stars were so bright they cast faint shadows on the ground. Lewis often used his sextant to navigate by these stars, measuring the angle of the moon or the North Star to find his place on the blank map. Imagine lying on the banks of the Columbia, the ground cool beneath you, looking up into that infinite sparkling dome. It is a crushing sense of scale, but it is not frightening. It is comforting. It reminds us that we are small and that our worries are smaller still. The legacy of the expedition is also found in the names they left behind. A map of the American West is a poem of their journey. There is Independence Creek, named for the 4th of July, Council Bluffs, where they met the Otoe and Missouri tribes, Floyd's River for the sergeant they'd lost, Judith River for the girl Clark loved, Salmon River, Clearwater, Bitterroot. These names are whispers of their experience, etched onto the geography. When we say these names, we are speaking the language of their discovery. One of the most profound aspects of their journey was the silence they encountered. In the modern world, silence is rare. We are surrounded by the hum of electricity, the traffic, the digital noise. But out there, in the deep breaks of the Missouri or the high passes of the Rockies, true silence still exists. It is a silence so deep it rings in your ears. It is the silence of a hawk gliding on a thermal, the silence of a seed falling into the snow, the silence of a mountain waiting for the seasons to change. The Corps of Discovery walked through this silence for 2 years, and it changed them. It slowed their pulses. It attuned their senses. Let us return to the river one last time. The water cycle is the heartbeat of this story. The snow falls on the Rockies, piling up in deep white drifts during the long winter. In the spring, the sun melts the snow, sending it trickling down into the creeks. The Loxa, the Selway, the Gallatin. These creeks join to form the rivers, the Snake, the Missouri, the Columbia. The water flows thousands of miles, carrying the silt of the mountains to the sea. It evaporates into clouds, blows back over the land, and falls as snow again. It is a circle. The water that Lewis and Clark paddled through is the same water that flows there today. It is timeless. Now, I want you to visualize yourself drifting on a small boat on this timeless river. The current is gentle but strong, carrying you effortlessly downstream. You do not need to paddle. You do not need to steer. The river knows the way. The sun is setting in the west, painting the sky in shades of violet, apricot, and deep indigo. The water reflects these colors, turning into a ribbon of liquid light. On the banks, the cottonwood trees are standing guard, their leaves rustling softly. Hush, hush, hush. The air is cooling down, settling into the valley for the night. You can smell the damp earth and the green willows. A beaver slaps its tail on the water in the distance, a sharp crack that echoes and then fades into silence. You're safe here. You are part of the long, slow story of this land. The anxieties of your day are being left behind upstream, washed away by the current. You are floating toward a destination of perfect rest. As the twilight deepens, the first star appears. Venus, the evening star. It hangs bright and steady in the western sky, the same star that guided Sacagawea. The same star that Lewis wrote about in his journal by the light of a tallow candle. It is a beacon of peace. The boat rocks gently, left, right, left, right. The rhythm of the water is slowing down your breathing, in and out, in and out. The sounds of the day are retiring. The birds have gone to roost. The wind has died down. The world is wrapping itself in a blanket of shadows. Think of the campfires of the expedition, the warm glow of the embers, the smell of the wood smoke, the feeling of the buffalo robe pulled up to your chin. The men are sleeping around you, tired from honest work, their dreams filled with the wonders they have seen. You are among friends. You are among the pioneers of the Spirit. The map is finished. The blank spaces have been filled with knowledge, but also with wonder. You have traveled from the wood-paneled rooms of Monticello to the muddy waters of the Mississippi, across the endless grassy ocean of the plains, over the stone fortress of the Rockies, and down to the crashing gray waves of the Pacific, and you have returned. You have come full circle now. Now, the land settles into the long sleep of history. The buffalo are grazing in the dark. The river is whispering its secrets to the stones. The mountains are standing watch under the stars. Let go of the oars. Let the current take you. The story is done. The history is safe. The night is here, drifting, floating, sleeping. Good night.